Parker.
Mr Chairman, I would like to focus my comments around the commencement date and the interrelationship between the clauses in this bill which limit or were to have limited the ability of the Commerce Commission to intervene in the event of uncompetitive practices by participants in the Telecommunication Act, in the telecommunication industry, and the clauses that are said to be in the contracts under which the Crown is said to be indemnifying Telecom in respect of all liabilities they may have in the future if they are found to have been acting anti-competitively and lose some of their revenue that they were otherwise expecting to get. Now, how could this be relevant? Well, it is possible that in the future part of Telecom could act in a way which abuses its dominant position. There's no doubt that once it builds this fibre network, it will be the dominant supplier of wholesale fibre in the country. And if it abuses that and charges some of its competitors too much or to consumers too much, then consumers lose both from the loss of vitality of competition from other telecommunication providers and also face higher prices than need be the case. Now, we've already heard David Cunliffe comment that one of the effects of the government's policy in this area is to force up the price of people who aren't on broadband. So the consequence of the arrangements that the government has seen fit to enter into with Telecom are that those who get their internet connections through the copper network will be being forced to pay a higher price than they would have been paying if nothing had been done. And one of the reasons for that is to have at least a price difference between internet services on copper networks and internet services on broadband fibre networks or fibre-based broadband networks in an effort to improve for Telecom the likely take-up of fibre-based broadband, because the cost differential will not be as great because the price of copper is being pushed up falsely. And Mr Chairman, the effect of this bill is just that. People who have existing services will be paying more for them. There will also be a cross-subsidy from urban areas to rural areas. Again, this is part of a pattern that we see from this government. The latest budget had $35 million, I think it is from memory, $35 million subsidy to the rural sector for new irrigation schemes at the very time when the government won't support things like the jobs at Kiwi Rail in the workshops to build wagons. They're subsidising the agricultural sector to that tune. And we've also got this cross-subsidy in respect of telecommunications industry where copper wire-based internet connections will be charged a falsely high amount in order to make the gap between the price for that service and fibre-based broadband smaller. So, Mr Speaker, you can understand, Mr Chairman, I should say, you can understand why the Labour Party is critical of these decisions. And indeed, we're also critical of the fact that there was an overpromise really by the current government before election saying that they were going to have the fast rollout of broadband, and here we are 2.5 years into their term and it's only just passing the legislative framework, haven't even signed the final contracts, and the broadband that has to be physically, or sort of the fibre that has to be physically put in place to deliver that broadband hasn't even started to be laid pursuant to the government's policy arrangements. Mr Chairman, I'm intrigued by how the provisions relating to Commerce Commission supervision of this industry have metamorphosised over the period of this legislation. The bill, when it was introduced into the House, provided that there would be a relief from Commerce Commission supervision in some areas, Mr Chairman.
Honourable David Parker.
There would be relief from Commerce Commission supervision of this industry, and this was achieved by Part 2 of this bill, inserting some changes into the Commerce Act, which effectively ousted the jurisdiction of the Commerce Commission to take action even if they found that there was anti-competitive practice on the part of a dominant participant, perhaps, in the industry. Now, that ran into problems in that there was severe criticism of that at Select Committee by other industry participants who thought that was inappropriate. They foresaw the risk that Telecom, if they were the successful tenderer or the successful contracting party with the government, they could foresee Telecom doing in the future what Telecom has done in the past, which is to use its position of dominance to the detriment of both consumers and other industry competitors. And so they danced and jumped up and down and said this is wrong. They convinced every political party in this House, other than National, that they were right and that National was wrong. As a consequence, National faced the reality that they would not be able to pass the legislation in this House in its then form. They had doubts from the ACT Party, from the Maori Party, from the Greens, from Labour, all who said that, look, we should learn from our history. Overly permissive regulatory regimes are taken advantage of by dominant telecommunication players to the detriment of consumers. And if we are creating a dominant player with monopoly powers, we ought to make sure that they are overseen with proper regulatory powers on the part of the regulator, in this case the Commerce Commission. Now, in the face of the reality that they probably couldn't have passed the legislation in that form, the Minister brought forward at very late in the process, through a supplementary order paper to this House, changes which backed away from some of those changes to the Commerce Commission powers. We don't have the benefit of what the competitors in the industry might think of that, because they've had no opportunity to submit upon what is now proposed. And in replacement for the abolition of those in return for the government moving away from removing those powers from the Commerce Commission, they have, we are told, instead conferred an indemnity under the form of contract that they propose to enter with Telecom, which promises Telecom that if they lose revenue because of a future Commerce Commission action, then the government will make good that diminution in revenue, even though the basis for that revenue being taken off them in the first place would have been abuse of their dominant position in the market. The Minister shakes his head and says that that's not the case, but of course the trouble that we have with that is that we haven't seen the nature of these indemnity clauses. We're told in the media that that is the effect of these indemnity clauses, that the government will be indemnifying Telecom against all losses occasioned by Commerce Commission risk. That is how I would paraphrase it. And if we have that wrong, well, how are we to know at the stage when we're passing this legislation? How are we to know? Because there is a lack of transparency as to what exactly is proposed. So, Mr Chairman, the Labour Party will be voting against the commencement title of this. It's sad. It is sad, isn't it? It is sad because we do think that there should be regulatory certainty that goes beyond one Parliament. We don't think that it's desirable that there is regulatory uncertainty, because it is true that that creates uncertainty for market participants, not just for Telecom, which is the market participant that in this context the government keeps focusing upon, but also for the other telecommunication providers who we need to be able to be secure in their future business model so that they can compete and cost effectively provide services to New Zealand consumers, so that we do have real competition in this market rather than being even more reliant on the dominant telecom provider. So, Mr Chairman, there are a number of problems that we have, both with the process that has been adopted to get to here in terms of the legislation, in terms of the delays that we've had in the practical implementation of broadband policy and with the bad policy that we have as an outcome of those matters.
Mr. Chair.
Honourable Stephen